Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Theology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Darren Shear, and this is the show for marketplace Christians seeking to explore and apply God's will for business. On this episode, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Mansfield. Stephen is a New York Times bestselling author and popular speaker who leads a speaker training firm based in Washington, D.C. He's also part-time senior fellow of public leadership and director of the Center for Biblical Leadership at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He first rose to global attention with his groundbreaking work, The Faith of George W. Bush, a New York Times bestseller that Time magazine credited with helping to shape the 2004 U.S. presidential election. And he's also written a number of other celebrated biographies of Booker T. Washington, George Whitefield, Winston Churchill, Pope Benedict XVI, Abraham Lincoln, and others. And his humorous but fiery Mansfield's Book of Manly Men has inspired men's events around the world. The Miracle of the Kurds, another one of his books, has been selected as Book of the Year by Rudol, the leading Kurdish news service. As a result of this book, Mansfield has become a respected voice in support of Kurds worldwide. And he's also the author of the book, The Search for God in Guinness, a biography of the beer that changed the world, which we're going to be learning about today. Stephen, welcome to the Theology of Business podcast.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, indeed. So what do you say? I know people might be a little bit confused, right? Some people might be a little bit confused right now. What do you say to people who assume Arthur Guinness, the founder of the Guinness Brewing Company, couldn't have been a devout Christian man because he started a beer brewing company?
Well, the opposite is actually true. The fact of the matter is that first of all, beer had been used in the church for years. In fact, one of my favorite little fun facts is that when times of plague happened, the Catholic Church actually baptized infants in beer because it was a safer alternative than the water. But anyway, that aside, another little fun fact is that in England, there had been a thing called the gin craze. I don't know if you know that Parliament had outlawed the importation of alcoholic beverages. So people began to distill gin on their own, and the whole country gave itself to drunkenness. And there was crime waves, and families were destroyed. So people who brewed beer were seen as actually doing social good. And that's why you'll often see monks and nuns, for example, on beer posters, because many of the great breweries in the history of the world were started by people of that calling who were trying to do social good. So the fact is that Arthur Guinness was seen as a Christian do-gooder, as a Christian man having an impact on society, not as somebody who had stepped into the secular world. So it's a little bit of reverse of the way we think today.
Yeah. And I think Martin Luther started a brewery, if I'm not mistaken. That could be a myth, but I believe it to be true. I know your doctorate is in history, so you would know.
Well, only because I've spent a little time studying beer. His wife was actually a brewmistress. She was a specialist. She had been a nun, and her job was to brew beer because it was so essential to life. You have to realize that during that era of history, people distrusted water. They didn't know about microorganisms. So they'd be dumping their garbage upstream, drinking it downstream. People would get sick and die. They said, well, water's not good for us. They literally believed that. So they used water to put out fires or feed the cattle, but human beings wouldn't drink it. And so as a result, brewing of beer was an essential thing because most people drank beer. I'm talking about just that with their breakfast. From the moment they were born, they drank beer because it was seen as the healthy drink to drink. So anyway, that was an important part of what she did. And then when Luther came along and married her, he actually sometimes wanted to be paid for his preaching in beer. He wasn't a lush or an alcoholic. It was just a measure of trade at that time. So, there's a book to be written. I doubt I'll write it, but there's a book to be written on the history of the Christian church and beer. It really is a central part of the narrative. And again, not because people were addicted or, greasing the skids to sin, but because it was part of the culture at the time, and the church used it and did good with it.
Yeah. Well, so much of the focus of your book is not so much on the beer itself, but on the man and the legacy of Arthur Guinness, the founder of the company. So what inspired him to start his brewing company. And you mentioned about the gin craze, but really he was acting on what he perceived as a word from the Lord, right?
Well, it was a word from the Lord that came through John Wesley. What happened was that Arthur Guinness was raised on the estate of an archbishop, and his father was the manager of that estate and was particularly known for brewing beer. People came from miles around to buy the beer from this estate. Young Arthur learned that craft, went to Dublin in 1759 and started his own Guinness brewery. But he prospered, he did well, but he really didn't have a distinctly Christian vision for what he was doing in business. It was the old sacred secular division. If you were called, you were a priest. And if you weren't called, you did quote unquote secular work like everything else in the world. John Wesley, though, went to Dublin and preached and said some simple words that changed Arthur Guinness's life. He said, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can to the glory of God. Well, that sounds simple to us, and we hear that preaching pretty much all the time now in our Protestant churches for sure. But it was new to Arthur Guinness. Again, he was living in a world dominated by sacred secular thinking that made everything not church work secular and lesser. So this gave him a Christian vision for what he was doing. He immediately began using his wealth to do social good, and he began to change what was done in the brewery, even in the lives of the workers. And that's the legacy, that's the heritage that I track in the book, all the way to, and I know I'm rambling on here, but all the way to 1928, where I actually start the book in 1928, the year before the Great Depression, because if you had worked for Guinness, you would have gotten funerals paid for. You would have gotten days in the country paid for by the country. You would have the company. You would have had nurses showing up at your house to show your wife. It would have been all male workers at that time. Show your wife how to have a healthy home and serve food correctly. You would have gotten libraries and sports teams and massage services. And I could just go on. And of course, 2 pints of the good stuff every day. And this was all because Arthur Guinness had this vision to use his company, I mean, the actual way he ran it with its employees, to uplift people and to impact them for the gospel. And that's the heritage that Guinness has been living out until very recently. And still in Ireland, the workers attempt to live out that part of the heritage.
Yeah. So beyond that encounter with Wesley and really heeding the words that were spoken to him, what is the evidence that he was really acting on, really expressing his Christian faith? Because, there's a lot of companies that do a lot of good work for their employees. You think about like the Googleplex and, sushi every day for lunch, and all these different kind of perks that really tend to be concentrated in kind of high competitive job areas where they're trying to attract talent, not so much for kind of the kind of lower wage workers, which I assume were probably the type of folks that were being employed at Guinness. But what is the evidence there?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, there's the character of Arthur Guinness himself. He actually was the founder of the Sunday school movement in Ireland. In England, it was a man named Robert Raikes that people who study Christian history would know. He started the Sunday school movement in England, and that's the Sunday school movement that more impacted the U.S. So he's sort of the great-granddaddy of the Sunday school movement that we still have, many of us in our churches now. But Arthur Guinness, believe it or not, was the founder of that movement in Ireland. He also defended Roman Catholic rights and did so with the Bible in his hands. He funded churches. He actually funded the rebuilding of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is probably on the site of a place where St. Patrick, the famous St. Patrick of Ireland, baptized new believers and baptized the pagan tribes. And Arthur Guinness was dead by the time this was finished, but his family did this, and they did it citing Scripture and citing the glory of Jesus, and citing the cause of a Christian Ireland. So I'm not trying to tell you that the Guinness Brewing Company was entirely Christian, and spouting Scripture all the time. But the family was strongly Christian and constantly gave what you might call scriptural footnotes for all the things they did for social good, both in the company and without. One of my favorite stories is the tale of how they defended the poor. And one of the Guinness heirs later on in the late 1800s got married. His father, who was the head of the brewery at the time, gave him £5 million for his wedding gift. Now, this is in the $200 million range now. And the next day, this Guinness heir who received that money went and moved into a hovel, moved into what we would call today the ghetto, and lived there for some months to draw the nation's attention to the cause of the poor. Now, here's a guy who's got a couple $100 million in his pocket, newly in his pocket. But what does he do? He moves into the ghetto with his new bride, so the whole nation's paying attention to the cause of the poor, and he's citing scripture as he does it. So this is the lore of the Guinness family, and it's pretty pronounced.
Mm. And there was it 100-year lease? Is that right? Like on the what was the arrangement with the actual land and?
Yeah, it's great that you asked this, because it's one of the weirdest things I've ever heard of. I can't even explain why. But when Arthur Guinness started his brewery in 1759 on the banks of the Liffey River right there in Dublin, he signed a 9,000-year lease.
9,000. I was a little off there.
I've never even heard of such. They actually, if you go to the storehouse in Dublin now and you go to the gift shop, they'll actually sell you a reprinting of a parchment that is that lease. They'll actually let you read the language, and you can take one home if you want to. But I've never heard of a lease like it. And they're obviously Guinness owns its own land, but the small portion that they originally bought is still part of that lease, and they're happy to pay the heirs. They're part of it. But 9,000 years. So that's some forward thinking right there. That's somebody planning for the future. I remember studying some Japanese business years ago, and they had 100-year plans and 200-year plans. We're fairly short term here in the West, but I've never before heard of a 9,000-year lease.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it like Cortez who burned the ships? I mean, you can build more ships, but you
right.
Can't get out of that lease.
No, that's right. That's right. And they're kind of proud of it. This is the forward thinking of our founder, but that's why they sell copies of it in the store. But I still think it says something. It says something that a man would go and start a business and would sign a 9,000-year lease. He clearly intended to have descendants. He clearly intended the business to survive and do good for generations, and it has.
Yeah, and just there's some other items that you could maybe list off that were kind of unique about what they had done at Guinness in terms of taking care of the employees. Like, for example, I was reading that they were one of the first to provide pensions. And is that correct?
Yes, first to provide pensions. They paid 20% higher than average salaries. They provided an early version of company life insurance. It was pretty amazing. I mean, it was a 1800s version, really advanced of what, as you said earlier, Google and Amazon and these companies that we kind of see profiled in the news. They were doing an early version of it, and they invented whole new mechanisms. Intramural sports teams built into a company, for example, was absolutely new. They invented that whole idea. Nobody else had done it. The idea of giving the product of the factory to the people, whether it was a chocolate factory or what have you. Again, 2 pints every day. That was not just, hey, go to the bar and have a drink. That was, this is a health drink. I mean, your teenagers, your wife, they're drinking this because they don't trust the water. So it was all many things like this. One of the things I really like, kind of a humorous thing, is that they would fund a trip to the country every year for all the families and all the workers. And they actually had a dating office, so that if you were single working for the company, they would work all year to make sure that you had a nice young lady to take to the country on their dime. Mm-hmm. So they also were the first company in the world to have a dating office. Can you believe it? And it was all about the fact they wanted to get their workers out to the country, because they were, of course, all working in downtown Dublin, and they wanted to get them away from the grime and the dirt. But innovations like that, pretty stunning.
Yeah. And a lot of this was kind of going on during the temperance movement. Is that right?
Yeah, the temperance movement would have been more in the U.S. It never really gained that much ground in the U.K. But there's no question people raised, I think the main issue was people marveled that you had this Christian family that owned a brewery, which a lot of Christians, mainly in the U.S., I'll have to say, the whole temperance movement really took root in the U.S. and not so much the rest of the world. But that God would use a family doing what some people consider to be a secular thing, a beer company, to do such good. And that I think I have to laugh, and I think it's almost the Lord's humor. And look, if you want to see how I can bless a business that's going to honor me. Let me show you what I can do with a beer company that most of you think is secular kind of attitude,
Yeah.
And I'm not quoting Jesus there. I'm just saying that was sort of the mentality of the Guinness brewery.
Yeah. I mean, and like you were saying earlier with the gin craze, so much of that temperance movement was aimed at hard liquor, not so much on, I mean, what really was understood as a nutritious, I was reading that for the employees whose wives had recently given birth, they would give small bottles of Guinness with vitamin B rich yeast sediment for nutrition to these mothers who were recovering from giving birth. But so this was really a much safer alternative, and it's also interesting that so much of what kind of gave birth to the faith and work movement in the United States had to do with this issue of drunkenness in factories. Like from what I was reading, I mean, they could hardly find workers that wouldn't show up to work just completely blitzed, and which was causing a lot of accidents on the job and so forth. I mean, I would assume that with the Christian values that they had, I mean, were they teaching kind of the virtue of moderation when it came to alcohol? Or
yes, they absolutely were. And it's interesting. There was a great deal of distinction made between what happened when you drank beer and what happened when you drank gin. There's a famous drawer and painter named Hogarth, William Hogarth. And Hogarth actually has something you can look up online, and your listeners can look up online. One drawing is of Gin Alley, and the other drawing is of Beer Lane. And on Gin Alley, people are drunk and they're neglecting their children, and there's crime, and the buildings are falling down. And the only institution doing well in that drawing is the pawn shop. But on Beer Lane, you now have people are happy, they're full-bodied, meaning there's symbolism of them being healthy. The arts are being done. People are flirting with people on the streets. In other words, there's vitality and there's health. There's just intention to have families and procreate and all that kind of thing. And only the pawn shop is doing badly in that drawing. So this is very much the Guinness mentality. Drunkenness is a sin. The consumption of alcohol is not. And if you have a choice, you should consume beer. You just put your finger on one of the important things was they not only said that beer has far, far, far less alcohol, but it's interesting that during their time that beer was perceived almost the way we might think of a smoothie today. If I'm feeling really drained and I'm traveling, maybe I'm in an airport, I'd love to find a smoothie king, and get a nice smoothie and get kind of hydrated. But beer, even though they didn't quite understand the science of it, beer had those the B vitamins that you just talked about, and it transformed health. So the Guinness has made this point a great deal. In fact, that's why in the 1920s, some of their most famous advertisements were Guinness good for you and Guinness for strength and things like that. Many people who are listening probably have seen those advertisements famous in the pubs of England. And this is why. And by the way, you put your finger on another important point, and that is that pregnant women were prescribed Guinness beer until the 1930s in England, until the 1930s, because, again, of those B vitamins, and it provided some other vitamins that pregnant women needed. So, again, we tend to think, wow, it's almost like we're thinking these doctors are telling these women to, just shoot scotch or something. It's just shocking. But when you think about how little alcohol there is in beer, and a little alcohol, we're told, is just a very little is good for pregnant women, and these B vitamins, this is the kind of thing that Guinness pushed. They realized, by the way, their beer, porter stout, even more stout, even more filled with nutrition than the average of what we would call blonde beer today. I'm not a beer drinker, but all of this is what Guinness put in its educational programs, put in its advertising, and tried to encourage people against the extreme of hard liquor. And I just make one more point while I'm ranting on here, and that is, we had prohibition in the United States, and what happened was this was certainly about some people's concern about drinking. It was also anti-German. We just fought World War I. We were opposed to the Germans. Brewing in America was largely a German concern, so we were opposed to that. Well, we now know that prohibition increased the illegal consumption of hard liquor in America. Hard liquor consumption skyrocketed. The drinking of beer fell off to almost nothing because those breweries got closed. And so it wasn't until beer kind of came back around that the alcoholism and hard liquor consumption dropped a bit to healthy levels. So my point is, you're making a great point, which is there is a correlation between the healthy consumption of beer and people not going to the hard stuff and destroying their lives. And the Guinness has made sure that their society knew about this.
Well, Stephen, thank you for highlighting this story of this great man of God, Arthur Guinness, and the legacy that he's left behind. And we need more of these stories, because typically if I ask, who are the heroes of the Christian faith, people immediately think, Billy Graham and others who stood behind pulpits. They don't often think of the R.G. Letourneaus and John Wanamakers and Arthur Guinnesses of history. And so thank you for bringing this story to the forefront. As we wrap it up here, what action do you want people to take as a result of what they've heard today, Stephen?
I'd like for people to understand that there's a relatively small group of people called to be clergy. The majority of us are called to be in the marketplace. We're called to bring our Christian principles to the marketplace. We're called to prosper. We're called to be successful if we can be. And then to do exactly as Wesley said, make all you can, save all you can, give all you can to the glory of God. And there's never been a more important time. We need to fund the gospel. We need to fund the kingdom. And we also need to be people in the marketplace who are righteous. I'm very proud of the Green family, for example, of Hobby Lobby fame, who are, right there with the Gateses and the Jobs family and others, being strong Christians in the marketplace, being successful, using their money to the glory of God. So that's what I urge those who are listening to us, watching us now. You realize that people are called to business. They're called to the marketplace. They're called to so-called the private sector. And that's probably the vast majority of us. So let's use our gifts to the glory of God, ask God to help us prosper, and then use our wealth for the glory of God. And we can impact this generation with that kind of thinking. Beautiful.
So good. Again, the book is The Search for God and Guinness, a biography of the beer that changed the world. You can get that pretty much wherever books are sold. And also at StephenMansfield.tv. That's Stephen with a PH, not a V, Mansfield.tv. And you can check out all of his he's an extremely prolific author. I'm sure he's got a couple other dozen books he's in the works. But anything else you want to say about how people can get connected?
Yeah, check me out at StephenMansfield.tv. I do a lot of work with men, and I think this is an important part of what you're talking about here. I certainly value women as leaders and in the marketplace and what have you. But check out Great Man TV. GreatMan.tv is the website, Great Man TV. And all of my social media is Mansfield Writes, Mansfield Wright, just my last name with WRITES. And we'd love to have you jump in with us.
All right, Stephen, thanks for helping us grow today. And again, for this incredible story of Arthur Guinness and the Guinness Brewing Company. We're better for it.
Great to be with you, man. God bless.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can share your feedback and get more information to help you partner with God in business and disciple your company, your industry, and your community at theologyofbusiness.com. The Theology of Business podcast is sponsored by Highbridge Books and Media, a media agency specializing in publishing and promoting the world-changing ideas of inspiring thought leaders through book publishing, website development, publicity, email marketing, social media management, podcast management, and video-based course publishing. Take the next step to share your message with the world by contacting us at highbridgemedia.com. Thanks for listening, and keep partnering with God in your business.